Welcome back to Hofmvn, everybody. I'm Brian, and this is our review series, Buy or Skip. Our goal here on Buy or Skip is that by the end of this video, you'll have my opinion on enough information to know if you should buy or skip any given game. I played through Dying Light 2 Stay Human, and here is my review. Released February 3rd, 2022 on the PS4 and 5, Xbox Series X and 1, Nintendo Switch, and PC through the Epic Game Store or Steam, Dying Light 2 is a follow-up to the underdog hit that was Dying Light from the self-publishing developer Techlabs. I recently played through the first entry to the series about a month prior to the release of Dying Light 2. I know I was absolutely late to the party on that game, but with enough people telling me how much I needed to play Dying Light 1, I gave it a go and was enormously surprised by how far ahead of its time it felt for when it was developed, and for sure a game that I think everyone could easily go back and play whenever you get the chance. The story and gameplay was top tier, but for the purposes of this review, if you're wondering if you need to play Dying Light 1 before you pick up its sequel, you absolutely do not. Outside of a few references and understanding some of the nuance to a couple of the minor story beats, Dying Light 2 is wholly its own zombie, and with a brand new protagonist and new city for you to experience, you can just jump right in and get this going. And with that, let's begin with story. You know, sometimes when picking up or getting into any type of zombie piece of media, I feel like it's just chalked to the brim with things I've done or seen before. From the campy zombie movies of the 70s, Walking Dead's brutal and cynical world on TV, or even books like World War Z, there's just so much ground that's been covered already. I wonder how much room is left in the genre before it's just over and done with. I'm looking at you, Zack Snyder. This worry of mine is even further compounded by the fact that this is a sequel to a zombie game that I feel told all the story that there was left to tell in its universe. Where the original game has you experiencing a zombie outbreak from just about the beginning of its origin in one city, Dying Light 2 Stay Human jumps ahead 11 years past its origin story and sets you in the world that has completely fallen apart and for all intents and purpose has lost the fight to the zombie outbreak. Your story begins with our protagonist Aidan Caldwell, a pilgrim who is in the outskirts of the main playable city, Vellenor. You'll come to find out through this playthrough that a pilgrim is a type of courier that moves between major city hubs in the world. While this is valuable to the survivors in this world, as the pilgrims are some of the only people who travel outside of the cities, the pilgrims are still vilified and generally hated wherever they go. Think of them as pretty much any New York Yankees fan that doesn't live inside of the New York metro area. Our pilgrim's journey has led him to Vellenor because he is in search of his long-lost sister Mia, and he's tracked down information to her whereabouts in the city. On this continual grind for more information, your character will be thrust into the middle of a three-way conflict. It is in this conflict that you will have to make game-binding choices on who to side with, who to save, who to lie to, and ultimately all of these combine together to decide the future for Vellenor. A lot to ask from a guy who is just generally despised because of his occupation. Now, if you're like me, you saw the tweet from the developer Techlabs about a month ago that shook the gaming community to its core. Everyone was up in arms about this. Bit of a joke there, but it was boasting that this game had about 500 hours in it to complete. And with the whiplash from Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed Valhalla, a lot of gamers took this to mean that they would have to spend that much time to beat the game. But rest assured, as Techlabs has clarified now, there is only 500 hours worth of content in this game if that's what you're looking for. My personal playthrough clocked in about 33-34 hours. I stuck largely to the main quest line, but also dabbled quite a bit in the beginning with every side quest or activity that I ran into. I think this first bit of deep diving set my level and skills so far ahead of the story that I pretty much just kind of coasted through the rest of the game with quite a bit of speed, actually. All in all, I think the average person looking to enjoy this game at their own pace would probably put in about 40 hours into this game. And if you start digging around in side quests, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. I've heard that to complete this entire main story and the side quest, you're looking at about 80 hours of playtime. Whichever way you shake it, bare bones playthrough or a deep dive of this game will have you covered for a long, long time. Now, while I generally did enjoy the overall story of the game, and especially enjoyed the side characters created, I do have some problems with the story category. First being that I felt the story was a bit too predictable. Without giving anything away in terms of spoilers, this storyline they build for you, you begin to figure it out and you kind of understand what's going to happen at about the 25-hour mark. And once I hit that part of the story, I felt like I knew what was going to take place and I was just waiting for the scenes to come up, and I was kind of right for the most part. Another problem can be broken down in the way the story plays out overall. There is about a halfway point in the story where the city opens up to you, you're in modern Vellenor, or would have been modern before the zombie apocalypse, and you're introduced to Rosario Dawson's character, Lawan. And while I love this character and the actress, I also feel like this is when the story and the way it is being told felt like it got put a bit on the rails. While the first half of the game, I felt I had been loosely in control of the plot lines and I was taking part in the story. Once the second half hits, I feel like I'm just more so along for the ride, right? And everything's just a lot more choreographed sequences. It made me feel like I was just watching the story instead of participating in it. And side note, their use of the getting smacked on top of the head and punched, getting knocked out from turning into a zombie or whatever was going on with Aidan, and then he wakes back up and the stories progress. That's just a bit of a crush they leaned on, I thought, a little bit too hard in the story. Now, one last thing before we stop talking about this game's story, I just wanted to point out how incredibly well done the side quests are in this game. So many times I was wrapped up and fully invested in the story of a side quest that I could not care for the main storyline of the game for quite some time. This is Bethesda's Skyrim level of interesting when it comes to the side quest. All of the characters felt real, had motives, and I can't wait to jump back into this game and just experience more of the side quests. We're going to talk more about that in the replayability section, but by the time I got to the end of this game, I felt regret for pushing ahead in the story for time's sake because there was just so much more that I wanted to experience before the end of this game wrapped up. Overall, the story for Dying Light 2 is extremely well thought out, albeit a bit predictable at times. If you're like me, you still get caught up in the story of these characters and the world they're in. It's a wonderful story, and everyone deserves to experience it. Next up, graphics. For the purposes of talking about the graphics of this game, let me tell you that I was playing this game on the PC with the GeForce RTX 2080 graphics card in my system, and I ran everything that I remember on high graphics setting, maybe with shadows on medium or something like that. And I also had ray tracing turned off so that I could prioritize the frame rate, which for me is really the most important aspect of any game. And with all of that in mind, and for the record, I want to state that I think this may actually be my favorite and most immersive first-person experience that I've ever had in a game. Even when compared to the best parts about Cyberpunk, the world and the characters inside of Dying Light 2 had me more pulled in and believing them as actual people that I've ever experienced before. Truly. I think a lot of this comes down to the overall art direction of this game. Starting with the characters that you interact with. Everyone feels as if they're wearing clothing and outfits that have been lived in and that have layers to them. They're kind of ripped and torn. And I generally don't experience this inside of gaming. It makes me think of the real world when I see the character designs in this game. When certain characters would have the shirt sticking out, you know, the shirt would be sticking out with a fold from behind their jacket. I was mesmerized by that level of detail. I don't know why, I felt like I could reach out and just touch it. And for a game that has that awkward centered up front facing dialogue scenes, kind of how Skyrim and Fallout does it right, the engine that Techland has used here, it creates a game that feels like the next evolution of Bethesda's creation engine, but redone from the ground up to make characters feel more natural and comfortable to be around. It will be extremely interesting for me to see how this game holds up to Bethesda's Starfield later this year, as I feel like Dying Light is pretty much built around the idea of Skyrim, but, you know, with zombies. I've never been a huge fan of Bethesda's creation engine, to be honest, and when it comes to the human models, they just kind of feel unnatural. But Dying Light 2 absolutely nails their character model, and I feel this is what Bethesda has been chasing for years. When we pull out a bit and look at the city of Vellenor, you'll just be blown away by how gorgeous this game has been made to look. The first Dying Light, while technically very pretty and it was very immersive, it was impressive, right? It was still very drab to look at. Most things felt a bit desaturated to give the game that nice zombie apocalypse vibe. The sequel, on the other hand, does not shy away from spreading color all over the city. The effect is a rundown city that's been overgrown with wildlife that is wonderfully lush. This game does for a European city what I feel The Last of Us does for the western part of the United States. The greens and the red that the art team have pulled into the city just make it feel so much more real than the first game for me. It's the difference between seeing Mexico on Netflix and going to it in real life. The first just has that weird orange filter over everything, and the other is just actually beautiful to see and is like anywhere else you experience on the planet. Building interiors might be my only complaint when it comes to the setting of this game. And once you've been into a few of the buildings, everything just kind of starts to feel the same. Now, in the main story hubs and on the quest line, the buildings do look more unique. And the bazaar and the massive ship that the Peacekeepers call home, those are also unique and very, very gorgeous, don't get me wrong. It's just the rest of the city at times feels like it's, once you've done it before, you feel like you've seen it, you know? What are you gonna do? It's a huge city, because to be fair, it's the scale of this game is just so impressive. The mere fact that you can go into so many buildings is a statement all into itself. Additionally, I always felt that in the game, during the story sequences, the lights were just kind of turned off and it felt like I could barely see what was going on. I know it was supposed to be dramatic for like storytelling perspective and purposes and stuff, but someone turned on a light. I couldn't see anything. Everything was so dark in this game when they forced my flashlight to be turned off. One last bit I really want to touch on before we move on is the weapons. It's a Dying Light game. We've got to talk about the weapons and their art models. Now we'll get to just how amazing all the mods look on the weapons, right? And how their functions tie into the gameplay. We'll talk about that in the gameplay section of this review. But I really just want to point out just how much variety there is in the weaponry of this game. From signposts and shovels to saw blades to the katanas, the game really does have everything that you would want in a zombie experience. Everything that hasn't been nailed down is there from the art team for you to use, and some of the things that probably have been nailed down are still there as well. The art team did not lack in their designs, and then coupled with how every weapon has their mods visibly shown on the weapons that you're using, it's just an absolute accomplishment that really made the RPG systems in this game feel a bit more tangible and a bit more important to me as a player. It felt like what I was doing in the systems of the RPG showed up on the screen, and that's something that I feel a lot of RPGs miss, and it's something that Techland nailed. The next category, gameplay. It seems like the only genre that has any sticking power nowadays is the open world adventure. I've been through a ton of fads when it comes to the gaming industry, but the one that seems like developers generally do not want to throw in the towel on are open world games. Dying Light 2, like its predecessor, is that open world experience. And just to be upfront, this is one of my favorite open world experiences I've ever played through. It's up there with the likes of Skyrim and Red Dead 2 when it comes to world building and care that had been put inside of it, right? And I'm actually really excited about that because honestly, with 2 more open world games coming up just this month with Horizon Zero Dawn's sequel, The Forbidden West, and Elden Ring coming out, if this game wouldn't have nailed the open world experience, I don't know where my headspace would have been when going into the reviews of those games. One of my favorite aspects about this open world game is that, like in Dying Light 1, you're not necessarily in an open world as much as you are in an open city. This contrast really lets you be a bit more focused by the developers and your own mind in keeping yourself on somewhat of a track and what you need to be doing inside of the story, while still not feeling like your day is blown just because you went off to do a side quest. Even with fast travel involved in this game, between parkour and them introducing the paraglider, getting from end to end in the city really is something that feels like it can be done within, I don't know, say 10 minutes. Let's start talking about the gameplay more in depth with the game's leveling system. Trimming down a skill tree by 1 from the original game, this game has you level up your combat and parkour skill trees independent from one another and based on your in-game actions. Throwing a punch or jumping over a wall will give you XP to the respective trees that are filled with very valuable skills that you will want to pick up along the way. Combine these 2 skill trees for your combined overall level in this game, you'll probably end up around level 5 or 6 with a pretty basic playthrough at the end of it, right? This skill tree mechanic is also overlaid with an inhibitor leveling mechanic that's brand new. Throughout the world you'll find these things they call inhibitors. They're left behind by the GRE, who are the evil scientists of the game, and for every 3 of these that you find, you increase your overall stat in combat or parkour. You get to pick either or, right? You can either have a really high stamina for parkour, or you can be a little bit stronger or healthier for combat, I should say. And now this determines how deep you can go into your skill tree. With your parkour level being higher, you can go deeper in the tree, same with combat, right? And it also increases your overall resistance in the darkness to turning into a zombie. This darkness resistance is a brand new mechanic to the game, and it's incredibly genius and adds a great sense of urgency to Dying Light's 2 gameplay that I just adore. Whenever UV light, whether it's natural or artificial, isn't showering down upon you, timer is started and there is a ticking clock to just how long until you turn into a zombie. This mechanic turns a simple supply run into a building from going pretty steady with exploration and kind of boring to a 3-minute drill to find what you need and get out before you become a zombie, or you need to find a way to reset your timer with kind of an inhaler thing or finding UV light, right? This by far is one of my favorite additions to Dying Light 2, something that I thought at first was going to bug me throughout my gameplay once they introduced me to it, but it turned out to be one of my favorite aspects of the game, and honestly, I think more games should introduce mechanics that give you the sense of urgency like this, and it felt really natural for this game too. I honestly think the developers went a little bit too easy on the player with this timer, and you turning into a zombie. I wish it was a little bit more punishing, because by the end of the game, I could stay in the darkness for 10 minutes and it just really didn't matter. But at the beginning of the game, it felt really terrifying and prohibitive, even though it kind of wasn't. It was just more terrifying. I just didn't realize how easy it was, I guess. Next, let's talk about combat and parkour. Combat overall is handled very well in this game for a first-person experience. Unlike the first game, there are not really any guns to be found throughout the world of Dying Light 2, and you'll mainly be relying on melee weapons and a bow and arrow to kill all of the baddies. Whether that baddie is a human or a zombie, both provide their own level of difficulty and uniqueness and challenge that you'll have to make your focus in a fight. Even when you're pretty deep into the game, it still remains challenging. One thing in particular that I liked about the humans was their thoughtfulness of actually trying to surround you in a fight instead of just having them path straight towards you. They'll try to get on your backside while you're fighting their friends and try to smack you on the back of the head. This type of situational awareness that you have to keep, it just makes the game totally fun throughout the entire experience. Also in combat, the addition of parkour combat moves was just way too fun. Blocking an attack just to parkour jump kick over an enemy to hit his best friend, it never gets old. I think one of the things going into this game's development that developer Techland had to have at the top of their whiteboard and circled like 3 times was the word parkour. For a game that was defined by its parkour mechanics in Dying Light 1, they had to nail the parkour in the sequel. And for me, I will say the parkour was a bit of a hit or miss. Overall, I think it's an absolute step forward in the game and the mini genre of parkour first-person games, which is like these 2 games and Mirror's Edge, right? They evolve the amount of moves they're able to do in this game, and they all feel like a pretty natural progression of the parkour systems, and the rope swinging from stationary ropes or from like your grappling hook, those were a ton of fun every time. Great step forward. The parts that were a miss for me started with the overall feel of the character. After just playing Dying Light 1, I do feel the parkour in that game felt a bit more crisp and precise. It feels to me like this was more a deliberate decision from the developer to make the characters feel more human-like and not just like a floating head in the game. And while I can see where they're coming from, the crisp parkour from Dying Light 1 was just sublime, and I felt like I really did miss it here in this playthrough. Another part of the parkour that I wasn't necessarily keen on would be the actual city itself. In the first area, Old Vellenor, you had this old European roof style that you could run on. You just had this absolute flow going. It just felt natural to be running around that area. But once you reach the second half of this game, and the more modern part of Vellenor is opened up to you, the game introduces these high-rise buildings, and these high-rise buildings are amazing to look at, and the scale is really impressive, but they serve as a hindrance to the actual flow of the parkour in the Dying Light series. In my mind, is known for that, and any hindrance to that kind of flow just kind of ruins it a little bit. To alleviate this pain, the paraglider tool was introduced so that you could fly around the city, and that was an absolute blast. The up and down motions of the paragliders and the airshaft levitation kind of minigame thing they got going on, it never got old, so kudos to Techland for the introduction of that paraglider, but the amount of high rises, the amount of back and forth trying to scale those high rises just kind of took it away from me. Now, when it comes to the inventory of this game, I really like what Techland decided to do and keep their RPG core. They still have weapons, they still have armor sets, or not sets, but just armor, and they're loaded with stats in this game. Each weapon variety has a handful of mod slots, like the basic ones have 2 slots, legendary items will have 3, and this allows you to customize your favorite weapons, it lets you give it a little bit of extra power and effects on its hit. I really dig that aspect of it. I also really enjoy that Techland removed the option to repair your weapons. And while I did cry a little bit when my favorite flaming katana got broken, I did end up using a huge variety of weapons in this game, which made for a blast of a time and kept combat feeling fresh just instead of the building one overpowered weapon and using it for 5 hours straight. So thank you to the developers for making this game feel flavored when I could just keep eating my strawberry Pop-Tarts all day long. For the armor in the game, there are 4 different types of armor archetypes for you to equip based on your different playstyles. You can either be a tank, a brawler, ranger, or a medic, and each of these archetypes has stats that cater to different playstyles for the player. While I like this idea overall, I also never really got the sense of how good my stats were, when I was swapping out gear. I knew I liked one-hit weapons. That was more of a brawler thing, so I just equipped in my highest level brawler item and just went for it. I didn't put a lot of thought into my armor, and I kind of wish I would. I would like to lean a bit more into the stats for like min and maxing stuff. That's just kind of how I like my games. But the mere fact that this world isn't dismantling RPG at its core, I dig that. I think a lot of games now are trying to get away from those deep RPG mechanics. Techland just kind of hold them to their guns, even at a AAA level. I just appreciate that, man. I appreciate developers who stick to RPGs. It's a ton of fun for me. And the last big thing I want to talk about in the gameplay section here, and I know it's kind of beefy, is just how exceptional I feel this game was paced with this gameplay. There are a lot of mechanics to learn in this game. There's a ton. And Techland did a fantastic job at doling out each of these mechanics at a pace that didn't feel overwhelming. But it also never really made you feel bored either. And then we get to the Night Runner toolkit, which is about 6 different items that you pick out throughout the game. And it just keeps the entire playthrough feeling fresh the entire time. Every time I feel like I was getting a bit more comfortable and I kind of figured out how the city was moving and how I should be thinking about this game, bam! And here it is, a grappling hook to completely make you rethink how this entire map works. It was amazing, it was well paced, it's game development, it's gameplay design at its finest. I loved it. Thank you Techland for this game and the gameplay of it. I had a blast. Next up, sound. In my opinion, there is nothing more important to the design of a game than the sound design. I think that most gamers drastically undervalue how much sound does for the gameplay and the world building of a video game. When playing through Dying Light 2, I found myself absolutely stunned time and time again by just how good everything was that I was listening to. I think one of the most terrifying senses that has ever come over me in a video game has come from this game. It's nighttime out, I can barely see anything that isn't directly in front of my face, and it's not the sound of a zombie that is terrifying to me, but it's the sound of a person screaming out for help, and I can't tell where they are. There's too much of an echo to their voice, they seem too far away, and I just listen to them scream until it's gone. And up until this point, they were a survivor of a zombie apocalypse, and they have finally succumbed to something that they should have gotten taken care of 11 years ago. It's this type of sound design that is riddled throughout the city of Vellenor. And not everything is hopeless. Some of those screams you are able to go and get, you're able to save them and be the hero, but it's the overall soundscape that Techland has built that it makes the city and the story feel haunting. There's emptiness to the city, man. It just makes you feel sometimes incredibly small in this open world. The sound effects of all the weapons in this game are immensely satisfying as well. Everything has that extra thump that you think you would have in real life, even when it couldn't, right? My personal favorite is the sound of the Wolverine-like hand claws that you get in this game. Something about the quick shink and the hits, they do it for me every time. And the sounds of the zombie are equally as terrifying as the weapons are satisfying. They seem your standard zombie fare, you know, the grunts and the moans and the screeches where they need to be, but to me, the best sounding zombie in all of Vellenor is the volatile. There are stealthy elements to this game where you're just hiding under a desk while the monster, the volatile, it's passing right next to you, and you can just hear the strength of them breathing through them. It's a terrifying sound, it's amazing, it's great sound design up and down. I love the volatile in this game. And now the voice acting in this game is absolutely top-notch as well. It has great performances all across the board. The main character, Aidan, he's voiced by Jonah Scott, great performance. Rosario Dawson is an important side character, Lawan. She does a fantastic job as well. All of the side characters and even the NPCs, they've all done really great work with their voice actors in this game. It makes this game just feel like it's alive, and the story hits harder because of it. The soundtrack for this game is just one of those OSTs that you're gonna want to listen to over and over. Where I remember a lot of Dying Light 1. It was a bit more rock and roll, it was a bit more guitar driven. I could be wrong about that, but in my head that's how I remember it, right? Elements of Dying Light 2 OST, on the other hand, it delivers this more lofty and serious tone with the use of string instruments, right? But then they also have synth vibes that come in when the game needs to feel fast paced and frantic, and then when it's at its best, it's combining these two elements to it's perfect. It's a perfect soundtrack. The melody, the OST's third song, The Good the Doctor, it's lofty, it's hauntingly sad. It's just up there with some of the best scores I've ever heard in gaming or Hollywood. This soundtrack is huge. It's massive. You want to go look it up on YouTube. You want to go buy their soundtrack on Steam if that's your choice. It's a great soundtrack. I can't get enough of it, man. It's everything I want to hear in games. Our last category, replayability. Well, spoiler alert for about how big this game is, 500 hours. I wasn't joking earlier in this review when Techlabs came out and talked about just how big this game was content-wise. There was literally 500 hours worth of things to do in this game, apparently. I'll take their word for it, I just haven't had the time. What this game claims that it offers in quantity, I can assure you that it delivers on it in quality. In the story section of this review, I mentioned that I had played this game for around 35 hours for this review. Involved in that was pretty much the main story, the side missions in Old Vellenor, and the handful of side missions in Vellenor Modern, right? And while the main story was an absolute delight to play through, the side missions I did end up doing were absolutely wonderful to experience, and I barely had any of them. I could see so many side missions that I was passing up on my way to the conclusion of this game, and I cannot wait for the day after this review is posted so that I have time to go back and play through these side missions. I fully expect my playtime in this game to end up being around 90 to 100 hours, and just exploring and loving this game. Seriously, in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I was joking about that earlier too, but I have like 100 hours in that game. I love deep diving these open worlds. Now, outside of just an absolute girthiness, that is the content that is inside of this game, also girthiness spelled with 2 I's, not a Y, just in case anyone was wondering, I'm also extremely curious about another playthrough of this game and how it would fare with different choices at key points of this game. A lot of the time I could sense that the choices that were present would just kind of lead me to the same natural point of the story, but there were a couple of times where the choices felt like they really could go either way. And there are times in this game where you have to give key assets around the city to either the peacekeepers or to the survivors, and I'm very invested to see how the story plays out with these different choices and how the world looks because of that. One thing that I will say I'm a bit bummed out on for the replayability is just the standard open world trope that the developers have been using, and it just bugs me to this day. You reach a point to the story, you enter a door, and you're prompted, stop here. After this, you're in the end game. You can't turn back, Tony. Which that's fine, right? But once you've done this mission and you complete the games usually always revert to the point right before that, and all of the conclusion of the game is wiped away as if something different happens and you're left to finish the side missions, knowing the fate of all your characters are just lingering like 1 hour ahead of when you chose to start that mission again, right? It just kind of feels weird, man. I wish developers were a bit more creative, you know, and they would just find a way to leave the open world story in a way that the main character can just live in that world after everything goes down for the final mission. Maybe it's asking too much, maybe the story will suck then, I'm not sure, but the way it stands now, I'm just a bit bummed out by the way it's been. I think Red Dead did it best, where, you know, once the main ending happens, another character comes along and you kind of just get you get more, you can go back into the world and all the events of the ending are still relevant there, and you just get to play out the game and all the missions. It's just, Red Dead did the best. I wish other developers would take that and run with it. Now, to round out the replayability of this game, I think it's worth mentioning that while it's not technically replaying it, the developer Techlabs has promised that it has a 5-year commitment to DLCs for this game. How much of that is paid for, how much of it is free to play, I really don't know, but it's something to look forward to, right? Dying Light's the following DLC for the first Dying Light, right? The following, it's legitimately one of my favorite DLCs I've ever played. And it's almost to the point that I think I like that DLC more than the base game. They did some really good stuff in that DLC. And if that's any kind of indication of where things are heading for Dying Light 2, then I'm more than excited for this game's future and how much playtime I intend to get out of it. This game is huge, it's massive, I want to replay it. It's a fantastic open world experience. 500 hours, man. 500 hours, that's nuts.
You're in danger with me, Luan. You know it.
Fire skip, Dying Light 2. Sequels are tricky business. You need to deliver on everything that people loved about the first one, but change it up just enough to be fresh, but not too much where it's unrecognizable. With Dying Light 2, Techlabs threaded this needle perfectly, and it created a game that in my mind is a milestone for open world games and is the new gold standard for the genre for some time to come. It's a solid 9.5 out of 10. I recommend you immediately buy Dying Light 2. Alright, there it is. There is our review for Dying Light 2, Stay Human. I hope you enjoyed the review. Hope you found it helpful, helped you make a decision on whether or not you should buy or skip the game. If it did, make sure you leave a like on the video to let other people know that it helped you. And if you got your opinion on Dying Light 2, I'd love to hear it in the comment section down below. Please feel free to drop down there. If you want to see my playthrough for Dying Light 2, I got it all up on YouTube, Hofmvn Plays. You can click the little thumbnail down there and it'll start you off on our Dying Light 2 playthrough that we started on Twitch and then finished on YouTube. So it's all there on the Hofmvn Plays channel if you'd like to check it out. All right, that's going to do it for this video. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks you for watching. Have a good one. I'll see you guys in the next one.